let me start the questioning, and I may finish the questioning too, unless my compadres show up. In Belarus, has there been any change in the level of imprisonment of political prisoners since the 2021 elections? They arrested so many people then, but since then, has there been any change in the methodology of Lukashenko in arresting Belarusian citizens who object to his rule in the fraudulent election? Or have people just been less opposing and presenting themselves as opposition?
So first of all, I have to say that Belarusian people live in the country as in Stalin's time, in full tyranny and repressions. Of course, the aim of Lukashenko is to suppress people and showing political prisoners and they confessional video constantly, putting on propagandistic TV, all those messages about that everybody who's opposing the regime or supporting Ukrainians in the war will be detained. Of course, it's frightens people. And honestly speaking, since 2020, repressions, detentions haven't stopped for a day. Every day in Belarus, 15-20 people are being detained. Just in May only, 145 people were detained, and there is 31 women among them.
Were these people that were demonstrating somewhere, or were they just chosen by the authorities?
No, it's revenge for 2020 uprising, but also it's revenge for uprising in February 2022, when there are massive demonstrations against the war. And now you can be detained for anything. You don't have to be on the streets, opposing the regime. You can, donate Ukrainian army €5, you'll be detained for 5 years for this. You can speak Belarusian language, you can buy Belarusian books, you can, show solidarity and help families of political prisoners who are in dire also situation. Your solidarity is a crime at the moment. So you also a new wave of persecution of people is when people are active in exile. At least 500,000 Belarusians left Belarus since 2020, and if they're demonstrating in exile, or if they are politically active, or if they supporting political prisoners from exile, their relatives in Belarus are under attack. Their property is confiscated, in Belarus. So it's like if Lukashenko's regime can't reach people physically, they reach their relatives. So, and it's constant Lukashenko's message. So if you're active politically, if you are supporting the idea of sanctions, if you're supporting political prisoners, be ready to lose your property and think about your relatives. This is a clear message.
Have there been any releases of prisoners in the last 5 years?
At the moment, we have at least 1,600 political prisoners, ex-political prisoners, who have served their terms. So no pardons, no pardoning of people. So these people fully, from bell to bell sentence, served their terms. And
they're released after they've served their time?
Yes, some are released, some are not. We have cases when there's time when a person has to be released and relatives are waiting for this time, and already in prison, this political prisoner is accused, one more, accusation, and his term is continuing, and it can be endlessly, endlessly. Like recently, our Belarusian activist Polina Sharenda-Panasiuk, woman, her husband with 2 children, we were waiting for her just 1 month ago, and she wasn't released. Though they showed her in a propagandistic channel, and sometimes it helped people to get released faster. They used her but didn't release. It's it's revenge on the strength of this woman.
Revenge is a term we've heard lately quite a bit from one of the potential candidates for president, and he thinks it's a good thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned, and I think each of you mentioned, sanctions as a way to try to force releases of political prisoners. Can you cite any examples where sanctions or the increase in sanctions have resulted in the release of political prisoners?
I don't have a specific example of that on the top of my mind. I think it has actually possibly even led to, for instance, our friend Vladimir Kara-Murza being faced with such serious charges. What it does, however, is lift the impunity for these serious human rights violations. It makes it harder for instance, Vladimir Putin and his cronies to continue disrespecting any and all of international laws dealing with fair trial, fair process, and democracy and the rule of law, if we are going over there as well. What it does is make it more difficult for officials to participate in these things, for them to enjoy their time in the sun, going to different countries in Europe to buy luxury goods and benefit from their often very corrupt process, very corrupt actions that also result in political prisoners, as we saw in the case of Magnitsky, that involved insane amounts of money, so that I phrase it rather delicately. So what the importance of targeted sanctions is for the international community to show that it will cost your wallet if you are willing to violate people's fundamental human rights and your state isn't willing to do anything about it. So it attacks the impunity aspect of political imprisonment, which is one of the main facets of what allows it to continue, is that autocratic governments allow it to continue. But of course, just like I mentioned in my address, sometimes just naming possibility of sanctions is enough to get a political prisoner released. I mentioned Dr. Gubat Ibadoglu, who was released after a member of Congress here suggested there should be sanctions against Azerbaijan. I think the sensitivities of governments are also, they differ. Some feel quite confident that they will not be made to feel any real consequences, and we can point to examples like Turkey, who has a significant number of political prisoners. Some might say they have over 40,000 people imprisoned on political grounds, but due to their strategic and political status in the international legal order, they don't really have to face a lot of consequences for that, despite this very widespread lack of the rule of law and real judicial oversight to politically motivated prosecutions. So we also must ask ourselves, where do we draw the line in the sand? We should be imposing targeted sanctions against all states that have systematic problems when it comes to political persecution. And I'm naming here specifically the biggest offenders in Europe, which are Belarus, Russia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. And these, I think, are, hotspots that we really should focus on, because we will pay the price later if we do not act and if we do not focus on calling those to account that are responsible for it, because we will see a further deterioration of the state of rule of law in these countries. And so that I quote Vladimir again, internal suppression will always lead to external aggression. So it is important that we hold these governments to account.
I presume the two of you agree that sanctions is probably our best tool. Is that correct?
I would certainly say it's a very important tool. It cannot be the only tool. I think it needs to be part of a comprehensive strategy. But I would say in the U.S. especially, we have a lot more room to try sanctions specifically against individuals who are engaging in political imprisonment. Human Rights First has done some excellent research that showed from the beginning of implementation of Global Magnitsky Act through the end of 2022, arbitrary detention was mentioned as one of many reasons in the sanctions designation, but actually in 2023, sanctions for Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza's jailers, 3 Russians, were sanctioned by the U.S. That was the first time the U.S. had arbitrary detention of a single person as the sole reason for the sanctions. So there's a lot more room for us to try, and we should.
What I know that, sanctions is not silver bullet, but sanctions help to weaken the regime, to help to empty their pockets, that, they can give this money to Siloviki, to military forces, just to detain and terrorize people. But sanctions should be, harmonized For example, in the case of Belarus and Russia, on Belarus, more sanctions are imposed on import, on Russia on export. And two dictators using each other, circumvent sanctions very easily. And for us, people of Belarus, and maybe for opposition from Russia, it seems like one hand is trying to help political prisoners, trying to help Ukrainians to win this war, and the other hand is feeding the regime, continuing trading with them. So synchronization of sanctions, we are asking Europe, to watch what the USA is doing with secondary sanctions that are rather effective. But of course, sanctions have to be, they have to be not the only tool. Positive messages to Belarusians and other people who are fighting with dictatorship are also very important. Because when I always ask allies of democratic forces of Belarus, isolate Lukashenko's regime, but don't isolate people. It's so important to show people that, the doors of the democratic world is opened for you, that you are welcomed. We are weakening the regime, but strengthening people, strengthening national identity, strengthening alternative media, NGOs and so on and so forth. So people need energy to continue fight for political prisoners and fight for the country.
Are there other things you can recommend to the United States or to the European Council or the United Nations for that matter that could be done to bring more pressure and maybe result in some releases?
I think a lot more can be done when it comes to the United Nations, for instance, in calling Belarusian authorities as well as Russian authorities to account for these imprisonments. I also mentioned in passing prisoner swaps, which I think are in many cases almost the only option to secure the release of political prisoners, in particular those who we believe are, justified to fear that their lives are in danger or they have serious health concerns. And there, the United States is, of course, a very strong player in this field and the ability to be able to trade with nations that are willing to exchange people like that. So this, among also what Madam Tikhanovskaya mentioned in supporting independent media, supporting NGOs that have connections to people on the ground. So you have an NGO in exile in, let's say, Lithuania that has connections with people that are in the opposition on the ground in Belarus or in Russia, where civil society has mostly had to go underground. They continue their activities, but they have to do it a lot more secretly than before, because what we've seen, of course, especially after the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, is that these two states have intensified their draconian legislation, which was already very severe, but they have added, I've called it the unmasking of the Russian regime, this new approach that they have towards political imprisonment, whereas before they would find some fake reason for persecuting political prisoners. They would accuse them of drug smuggling or child molestation or all sorts of trumped up charges, but they would at least make up a facade of making it look real. But what they've done now is sort of just drop the mask and say, it's enough to criticize us and we can put you in prison. That's what their laws now say. And the same goes for Belarus. These actions have intensified greatly. So I think that justifies escalating things at the United Nations. I'm thinking about strengthening the sanctions system because, as was mentioned by Madam Tikhanovskaya, they are not fully effective, and there are many ways of circumventing it, and there are also ways of attacking that, and I think that we should be focusing on how best to do that.
Are there any voices in the Belarusian parliament to question Lukashenko and speak up for the political prisoners, or is that just a recipe for disaster?
There is... parliament in Belarus is like pocket parliament of Lukashenko. Nobody there is going to ask questions to these dictators. Their task is just to raise hands when it's necessary for Lukashenko's regime. So in Belarus, elections has nothing in common with elections. Parliament has nothing in common with the parliament in democratic sense of this word. So we can't rely on institutions inside Belarus. because Lukashenko built such a system that is obeying, personally to him. It's not serving to people of Belarus. So that's why we rely a lot on democratic world, on your institutions. And regarding what else can be done, I think that all the accountability mechanisms has to be used more effectively. Because in the case of Belarus, we have all the proofs of Lukashenko and his cronies' crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, abduction of Ukrainian children, migration crisis, so on and so forth. But no one special investigation has been launched or has been started against Lukashenko's regime, against all the perpetrators. We know the proofs of these crimes. Why so? That's the question. Why don't you use, democratic world doesn't use all the tools and instruments you have. You have international courts, court of justice, criminal court. There is such a mechanism as universal jurisdiction. So use it effectively. Show to people who are fighting with for release of political prisoners against dictators that democratic world is working.
And you feel comfortable and safe in Lithuania where you are? Is there any Belarusian underground or officials that have come over there and threatened you or anybody else that's taken political refuge there?
Look, all those people who fled Belarus, they're also targets of the regime. And nobody can feel safe, not inside the country, not outside. Even if we live in European countries or, or in the USA, we physically in safe space. But look, our relatives in Belarus, you can't feel safe. You every day, you feel pain for people in prisons, for hostages of the regime in Belarus, and so you don't think about your safety, you think about safety of your country and people.
Thank you.
I would love to add the issue that Ms. Tikhanovskaya is talking about of this targeting of individuals even after they've fled their home countries is what is known as transnational repression, and we've actually done quite a bit of research on that at Freedom House. So we have a database that looks at instances of direct physical transnational repression. So the most famous case of this is Jamal Khashoggi, right? But it's also things like being followed physically, being beaten up or attacked. And we use only open source information that we can cite to. And within those constraints, which suggests that what we are documenting is a drop in the bucket, we have still documented between 2014 and the end of 2023, more than 1,000 instances perpetrated by 44 countries in more than 100 other countries. And that's, more than 20% of the world's government. That's a very shocking fact. And when you think about the impact that has on democracies, a lot of times when people hear about political prisoner issues, they think it's not worth raising because this is some domestic issue in some far-flung place. And in fact, when repression intensifies enough that folks have to flee abroad, it becomes a global issue. I would say one other thing that you asked about, what else can be done? It's actually a very low-cost action, and that's simply just raising cases. And sometimes democracies do this very, very well, and again, we would commend the Helsinki Commission, but sometimes, quite frankly, we don't. And in the case of Azerbaijan, Leyla and Arif Yunus were released 5-ish years ago after a very high-level phone call from officials in the United States. So to the folks listening today who are policymakers, please don't underestimate your power in raising names. And we are, in democracies, not great at doing this with countries where we feel like we have other interests, but especially in those moments, we have such leverage. It would be such a waste not to raise political prisoner issues.
Well, we try to raise them. That's something we try to get at, but you don't get a lot of response sometimes. There's not, unfortunately, the public has not risen up in some ways and tried to express their voices as well, which we need to have. Now, you mentioned Khashoggi. You have no question that the Saudis were responsible for that, do you?
Well, we don't have access to classified materials. Of course, the information released in the press suggests that the CIA found that the Saudis were responsible, and indeed the United States did impose sanctions on several individuals, I think it was 44, who were supposedly involved in that case. It was not global Magnitsky sanctions, which allow you to publicly name the perpetrator. The U.S. actually used a different mechanism, which was a visa ban. So we don't know the names of all of those individuals. And then I think there were a few cases where sanctions did publicly release names. But that is definitely, the Khashoggi case is definitely the emblematic case that we talk about when we're trying to explain to people what transnational oppression is.
Does Bill Browder have a second level that he wants to pursue on sanctions or Magnitsky type?
Well, there are a number of countries that now have Magnitsky regimes, but they don't all incorporate corruption. So I know that that's something you may be able to speak to, General Rapporteur. But the UK, the EU, several Baltic nations have regimes. And actually, there has been some really good effort at coordination. A couple of years ago, there were joint sanctions issued on individuals in China who were involved in abuses in Xinjiang. But I think there still is quite a bit of room to grow.
Yes, many more people can be added to these Magnitsky lists. For example, in the EU, as far as last time I checked, they hadn't included the people responsible for the death of Sergei Magnitsky in their own Magnitsky legislation. So there is room for growth in the utilization of these Magnitsky laws. And I think that, as I referred to in my speech, what shows their efficacy is the level of vehemency that Mr. Karamurza has faced because of his involvement in the campaign, because it really has negatively affected the close allies of Putin and his regime, and this makes it more difficult for him to operate and maintain control. I also would like to say that I think that the importance of granting visa and assisting with travel documents can't be understated here when it comes to the support of political prisoners and their families. A recent example of Belarus refusing to issue passports to people outside of Belarus is something that I think we really should be looking into with all seriousness, because if we end up in a situation where many Belarusians might end up facing deportation because they don't have travel documents or what have you, we would be sending them back to the hands of Lukashenko and basically letting him play out his plan, which is to isolate Belarusians outside of Belarus and make it impossible for them to do their work and live their life normally. What we should also be looking into is the misuse of counterterrorism and money laundering measures against human rights defenders and political prisoners and their families. So countries that have a high incidence of political imprisonment and repression against NGOs and human rights defenders have a tendency to use the international systems that we use to flag suspicious activity when it comes to money laundering and terrorism charges, just as they have the incidence of requesting extraditions or red notices, as was made quite famous by Bill Browder's book, to use against political dissidents and their families. So what this does is make it impossible for them to travel. They will get arrested where they go. They face possibly being extradited to the country that wants to imprison them. And on top of that, with these anti-terrorism and anti-corruption measures, they will have a very difficult time opening a bank account, receiving money transfers, even using Western Union, having any means of sustenance, really, wherever it is that they choose to reside outside of their own country. So these are all measures that are used to make the life of political prisoners and their families or previous political prisoners unbearable. And we need to find a way to strike the right balance between the very legitimate goal of combating terrorism and combating money laundering. It's very important that we do that, but we cannot let that impact the possibility of people fighting for human rights to be able to live a dignified life in the country of their choosing.
Bill Browder is certainly a hero and a great man in the world, and again, probably not recognized as much as he should be, because his life is at peril, I think, every moment of every day, just as Hodorkovsky's probably is as well. And he's been an aid or a supporter of Bill's work, and he's to be commended. Tell me what you hear from your people about what's happening in Belarus. Is there any kind of a groups trying to form opposition to Lukashenko that going on now?
So first of all, I don't call our democratic movement as opposition movement because we Belarusian people are majority who are opposing, regime of Lukashenko. For 30 years, Lukashenko built a system that serves him personally, his personal security apparatus, but it's not about people. Majority of Belarusians are against Lukashenko, against unification with Russia, against the war, in Ukraine. So, of course, after our uprising in 2020 and after unleashed brutal terror in Belarus, our movement inside the country went underground. But still, people are bravely act small acts of sabotage, inside the country. They, like our local intelligence, they provide us with information, what's going on the ground. They provide assistance to political prisoners and our brave military volunteers who fight in Ukraine shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainians. So those who fled Belarus, they can be more active. And, our task, those who live in exile at the moment and want to return home is to keep unity, strengthen our civil resistance, strengthen our civil society, our media, our human rights defending centers, to show European perspectives, for people, to show alternative to Ruski Mir and to Lukashenko, but also provide assistance to people inside the country. So believe me, I absolutely sure when the moment comes, there will be window of opportunity for Belarusian people. They will be on the streets again. But people on the streets is only small part of uprising and resistance. Hard work is being done now. We are weakening the regime, strengthening people. We are looking for new allies in the world. We are formalizing relationship with the democratic world. Like we launched strategic dialogue with the USA, for example. It's a very important step for us. We have groups for democratic Belarus in many, many parliaments. So we strengthen an agency of democratic forces. And for 4 years, Lukashenko, despite of the repressions, and tyranny, he didn't make Belarusian people like him again. And he knows this. He feels very fragile. He feels very insecure. Now what he's doing now, he's selling our country piece by piece to Russia. He doesn't take care about our independence, our sovereignty, our nation. So he's ruining our national identity. We see the process of Russification in Belarus. It means that Russia interferes in our media, economy, education. They erase any connection with Europe in our historic books. They like Lukashenko with his hands erasing Belarus from the map of Belarus. So that's why resistance and uprising, it's not only the people on the streets. It's about movement, it's about unity, it's about solidarity, and it's about allies. No one war and no one fight cannot be won when you are alone. So we need allies, to stand with us. We are not asking the world to fight instead of us. Just strengthen us, be with us on this difficult path to democracy.
I can't recall exactly, but was there some attack on an individual in Lithuania recently, and maybe they thought it came from was it from Belarus? That ring a bell at all? A public attack, maybe the person got hit in the head.
Yeah, as I said, everybody is under attack, is target of regime, of Lukashenko. I suppose it was person from Navalny team. Yeah. But, you can't give policemen to every person, who live in exile. But we constantly produce, give instructions what to do when you think that you are, followed by somebody, that something's going on around you. So people, of course, have to take care of themselves. And, of course, we rely on, local security systems that verify people who enter Lithuania, Poland, where most of Belarusians are located.
I was able to attend a forum at the Peace Institute recently. There were a great number of groups that were trying to get more issues and people in Russia to get freedom and democracy and to do what they can to encourage people. And what we heard is there's a lot of resistance in Russia. that there have been a lot of contributions in rubles as well as euros to help people that have been injured in Ukraine. That's been cut off some by the Russians, but there was a lot of contributions to these groups, which indicates obviously people that are not afraid of Russia and not afraid of speaking up. And as we speak of people that are not afraid of Russia and not afraid of speaking up, I would like to recognize and designate as the honorary member, as this Helsinki Commission, the great emeritus Speaker of the House of Representatives and one of the great leaders, female or male, in legislative affairs all over the world, Ms. Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your kind words, for your great leadership on the issues of concern to U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's a very special day for us to have Svetlana come and testify in the Congress, along with your distinguished guest. Thank you, Madam, what do I call you, rapporteur in all of this. And again, the Freedom House, such wonderful advocates for freedom. Mr. Cohen and I just returned from Normandy. We were there to observe D-Day. We heard beautiful speeches about freedom, about the alliance that on that particular day turned the tide of the war in Europe and then persisted until freedom prevailed and justice was done. At the end of that war, it was noted that although Russia was part of the alliance that fought the Nazis at some point, it was also a country that took over so much territory after the war. And as we know, some years later, 1989, the Iron Curtain came down or went up, or the wall came down, whatever. But much of the injustice continues. Svetlana to us is just like the Statue of Liberty in life, just being so brave, so courageous, so stoic. I think about her, I pray for her, and I wonder how she is able to deal with the incarceration of her husband for such a long period of time and not knowing, as you have testified, what the situation is. But to go out there and galvanize women, especially in Belarus, to elect you president of the country, of course unable to assume the office because of the current occupant of that position with the support of President Putin. So please, all of you know how important your testimony is here, because we want to raise the awareness in our country of the situation in Belarus. We want to raise the support of the Congress to support the efforts there. And we want to shorten the distance between now and a time when Freedom House's goals will prevail in Belarus. So again, it's an honor, again, just fresh off of meeting so many of the surviving but lively veterans who were there, and the stories they told and the purpose that they served when they were kids. They were 17, 18, 19. The baby there was like 97. The oldest one I know from Baltimore, where I'm from, was 104. He was there. And but they all took great pride in what they did. But clearly the work is not done. And I thank you for that. I already have taken some guidance